The cavern seemed alive, breathing in tandem with the faint pulses of light rippling through the veins of etherium embedded in the stone. Each pulse cast fleeting shadows that danced along the jagged walls, shifting with the rhythm of the earth itself. Kyrith crouched low, his sleek frame hidden by the mist that clung to the ground. The cold stone pressed against his fingers, its dampness seeping through the thin leather of his gloves as he steadied his breath. The Voidfang daggers in his hands thrummed faintly, their curved blades resonating with the energy coursing through the cavern. The glow was subtle, an eerie green shimmer that barely illuminated the runes etched into the hilts, but enough to set his nerves on edge. The air was thick with the mingling scents of mildew and copper, the latter sharpening as he moved closer to his quarry. Every inhale tasted of damp rot, a reminder of how far he had sunk into the nether depths. Ahead, a flicker of torchlight betrayed their position. Kyrith counted the voices, each one gruff and laden with impatience. 5? No, 6. The leader's voice rose above the others, a gravelly bark that echoed off the cavern walls like the growl of a hungry beast. "The spire's ours," the leader snarled, his cleaver scraping across stone for emphasis. Sparks skittered from the blade, briefly igniting the shadows before they were swallowed again. "We find the shard, we bring it back, and the cult'll make us kings underground. Move faster, you worthless grubs." Kyrith's chest tightened at the word spire. The memories surged, unbidden. A cascade of ash and blood, the scent of charred fur, the piercing screams of his kin. His hand trembled against the hilt of his dagger. He forced the image away, locking it deep within himself where it couldn't distract him. Focus now. Revenge later. A marauder broke from the group, muttering as he wandered toward the cavern wall. Kyrith tracked him, the faint scuff of boots against rock betraying the man's carelessness. The marauder reached for his belt, cursing under his breath as he fumbled to relieve himself. Kyrith moved like smoke, his whisper armor muffling the slightest sound as he closed the distance. The shadows embraced him, wrapping around his form as though the cavern itself conspired with him. The Voidfang dagger slid between the marauder's ribs, piercing with surgical precision. The man stiffened, his breath hitching into a soft, wet gurgle before his body slumped forward. Kyrith caught him, lowering him silently to the ground. He stared for a moment at the lifeless eyes, the faintest glint of etherium veins flickering in their reflection. One down. He retreated into the mist, his movements fluid and untraceable. The others hadn't noticed. Their grumbling continued, a chorus of frustration and exhaustion that masked the silent predator stalking them. "Where's Kren?" one of them called out, his voice tinged with annoyance. The leader spat, the sound sharp and wet. "Probably lost his nerve. We don't need him. Keep moving." Kyrith allowed a faint smirk to tug at the corner of his mouth. No nerve left to lose. He slid closer, the mist curling around his ankles as though drawn to the subtle power of his presence. Another marauder paused, this time to adjust the straps of his boot. He cursed under his breath, oblivious to the figure descending on him. Kyrith's second blade struck with a whisper, cutting clean through the man's throat. Blood sprayed in a hot arc, splattering the stone in dark rivulets. The hiss of life escaping was drowned by the shuffle of boots further ahead. "Wait," one of them said, the nervous edge in his voice cutting through the group's chatter. "Did you hear?" The leader turned, his cleaver raised as Kyrith stepped forward, his daggers flashing like twin fangs in the dim torchlight. The cavern seemed to shrink around them, the air thick with the tension of impending violence. The leader swung first, the massive blade carving a wide arc through the air. Kyrith ducked low, the wind of the strike ruffling his cloak as he pivoted to the side. He surged upward, one dagger slicing into the man's wrist, with the precision of a predator aiming for the kill. The cleaver fell with a deafening clang, its echoes chasing the marauders as they scrambled backward. Kyrith didn't stop. He caught the next attacker mid-charge, their axe raised high. His daggers crossed, locking the haft in place before twisting it free. The Voidfang blades moved as one piercing the man's shoulder, while the other plunged into his chest. The marauder collapsed, gurgling as blood pooled beneath him. The leader staggered back, clutching his bleeding wrist. His eyes darted between Kyrith and the remaining men, now retreating into the narrow confines of the cavern. "You've got no idea who you're messing with, rat. The cult'll burn your kind from these depths." Kyrith tilted his head, his amber eyes glinting with cold fury. He advanced slowly, deliberately, his steps echoing like the ticking of a death knell. "Speak," he said, his voice low and carved from stone. "What do you know of the shard?" The leader's laughter was brittle, his bravado cracking under the weight of Kyrith's presence. "Enough to know it'll change the world. The ebon shard'll rise and nothing'll stop them. Not you, not anyone." The Voidfang dagger blurred, its edge slicing across the man's cheek with a speed that left his words hanging uselessly in the air. Blood spattered the stone, and the laughter turned to a howl. The others fled, their footsteps fading into the distant tunnels. Kyrith grabbed the leader by the front of his armor, dragging him close. His voice dropped further, each word a shard of ice. "The shard? Where is it?" The man's breath hitched, his panic a staccato rhythm against the silence. "The spire. They're digging for it now. By the time you get there, it'll be gone, and you'll be nothing but a memory." The dagger slid into his chest, Kyrith's eyes unblinking as the light drained from the marauders. He dropped the body without ceremony, stepping back as the echoes of the fight dissolved into silence. The etherium veins pulsed faintly above, their light a steady rhythm against the cold stone. Kyrith wiped his blades, their faint glow casting jagged shadows across his face. The shard. The spire. They'll answer for what they've done. Every last one of them. Without another glance at the carnage, he turned, slipping into the shadows of the tunnel ahead. The path twisted and wound deeper into the nether depths, where light was a distant memory, and the echoes of the past waited to be unearthed. Chapter 2. The cavern narrowed as Kyrith pressed forward, the walls closing in until the air itself felt heavy. Each step echoed faintly, the sound swallowed by the oppressive silence of the nether depths. The faint bioluminescent glow of etherium veins became less frequent, leaving Kyrith to rely on his night-adapted vision. The taste of damp stone lingered on his tongue, and the faint, musty scent of ancient decay clung to the air. His mind churned, replaying the marauder leader's final words. The spire. They're digging for it now. His home desecrated once before, now clawed at by scavengers and zealots. A low growl rumbled in his chest, a sound he rarely allowed to escape. The passage opened abruptly, spilling into a vast chamber. Kyrith stopped short, his ears twitching as his eyes adjusted to the new expanse. Massive fungal structures towered around the chamber, their bioluminescent caps casting a faint green glow over the scene. The air felt alive, charged with a strange hum that sent shivers down his spine. A sudden movement caught his attention. Kyrith ducked low, his daggers ready as a small figure darted between the fungal stalks. He tracked the shadow, noting the faint scrape of claws against rock, the uneven rhythm of its movement. A creature, perhaps? Or something worse? A deep, resonant growl filled the chamber, and the fungal cap shuddered as though responding to the sound. Kyrith froze. From the far end of the chamber, a massive form lumbered into view. It was a shadow worm, its long serpentine body coiling and uncoiling as its glowing eyes locked onto Kyrith. Its hide shimmered like oil in torchlight, a slick, impenetrable black broken only by faint, pulsing streaks of green. The creature reared, its maw opening to reveal rows of jagged teeth, each one dripping with a viscous, luminescent fluid. Kyrith tightened his grip on his daggers, his mind racing. He could run, but the worm would likely outrun him in the open chamber.
No, he would have to fight.
The worm lunged, its massive head crashing toward Kyrith with terrifying speed. He leapt aside, rolling to his feet as the creature's jaws slammed into the rock where he had stood. Shards of stone exploded outward, and the air filled with a cacophony of snapping jaws and grinding stone. Kyrith struck, his daggers flashing as he aimed for the worm's glowing eyes. The first blade glanced off its armored hide, leaving only a faint scratch. The second strike found purchase, slicing across the edge of its jaw. The worm recoiled, its roar shaking the chamber. Its tail lashed out, a blur of movement that Kyrith barely avoided. He ducked low, the tail grazing his shoulder and sending him spinning. He caught himself on one knee, his breathing steady despite the throbbing pain radiating through his arm. His eyes darted to the bioluminescent fungi, an idea forming as he noted the faint dust drifting from their caps. The worm charged again, but this time Kyrith moved not to strike but to outmaneuver. He led the beast toward one of the massive fungal stalks, waiting until it lunged before rolling clear. The worm's jaws snapped shut around the stalk, splitting it in two. A cloud of glowing spores erupted into the air, enveloping the creature. The worm thrashed, its roars turning to panicked hisses as the spores clung to its eyes and nostrils. Kyrith didn't hesitate. He surged forward, his daggers slashing in a blur of motion. Each strike found its mark, carving into the softer tissue around the worm's jaw and neck. The beast reared, its movement sluggish as the spores took effect. With one final, precise strike, Kyrith plunged both daggers into the creature's exposed throat. The worm shuddered, a final gurgling hiss escaping, before it collapsed to the ground, its massive body coiling one last time. Kyrith wiped the glowing fluid from his daggers onto the worm's hide, his breathing steady as he surveyed the chamber. The spores still lingered in the air, their faint glow casting an otherworldly light over the scene. He turned toward the far end of the chamber, where a faint orange glow hinted at a new passage. As he approached, the air shifted. The oppressive dampness gave way to a dry heat, and the faint scent of burning incense replaced the decay. He stepped into the passage, his eyes narrowing as the glow intensified. The corridor opened into a sanctuary of sorts, its walls lined with intricate carvings depicting scenes of battles, rituals, and the worship of a towering figure cloaked in shadow. At the center of the room stood a group of Duskrin clad in light grey robes, their faces hidden by hoods. One of them stepped forward, their voice calm and measured. "Welcome, traveller," the figure said. "You've entered the domain of the Ashen Vale. Few come here uninvited. Fewer leave." Kyrith tensed, his daggers held loosely at his sides. "I'm not here for trouble. I'm looking for answers." The figure tilted their head, their glowing green eyes visible beneath the hood. "Answers come with a price, and your kind carries many debts." Kyrith stepped forward, his voice firm. "The Shard. Tell me what you know." The group murmured, their voices blending into an eerie harmony. The lead figure raised a hand, silencing them. "The Shard is not yours to claim, but it seems you're willing to risk much for it. Come then, let us see if you are worthy of the answers you seek." The figure gestured toward a narrow archway at the far end of the sanctuary. Kyrith hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to tread carefully. But the mention of the Shard was enough to drive him forward. As he passed through the archway, the faint sound of chanting began, echoing through the sanctuary like the whisper of forgotten gods. The path ahead was dark, but Kyrith moved without hesitation. He would find the answers he sought, or carve his way to them. Chapter 3. The cavern narrowed again, the walls closing in like jagged teeth. Kyrith's claws scraped against the uneven stone as he descended a steep incline, his cloak whispering behind him in the darkness. Each step brought the chill of damp air that clung to his skin, the scent of stagnant water mingling with the metallic tang of etherium veins. The faint rhythmic pulses of light from the crystal veins flickered weaker here, as though the very life of the nether depths resisted his presence. The path was treacherous, littered with loose stones and jagged outcroppings that jutted from the walls like skeletal fingers. Kyrith paused, his ears twitching as he caught the faintest echo of distant voices. The marauders. Their words were indistinct, but the cadence was unmistakable. Commands barked with impatience, punctuated by the clink of tools against stone. Kyrith tightened his grip on his daggers. They're already at the spire. They'll dig up the shard unless I stop them. The thought ignited a fire in his chest, but he forced himself to remain measured. Rushing in without a plan would be suicide. He would need to use the shadows, just as he always had. The incline gave way to a ledge overlooking a vast chamber. Kyrith crouched low, pressing himself against the rock as his eyes adjusted to the dim glow emanating from below. The sight made his breath hitch. The netheric spire, or what remained of it, rose like a broken tooth from the center of the chamber. The once proud structure, once home to his kin, was now a crumbled ruin, its towering spire shattered and half buried beneath rubble. The faint green glow of etherium veins traced through the stone, casting eerie shadows that danced across the jagged remains. Dozens of marauders moved among the ruins, their crude armor clinking as they worked. Some hauled heavy tools, their grunts of effort echoing off the cavern walls, while others stood guard, their weapons gleaming faintly in the dim light. At the center of it all stood their leader, a massive figure clad in spiked plate armor. His voice boomed as he barked orders, the sound reverberating through the cavern like the growl of a beast. Kyrith's claws dug into the rock beneath him. This was my home. My clan died here, and now they defile it.
Kyrith slipped from the ledge, landing softly on the uneven ground below. He crouched low, his movements fluid as he blended into the shadows, cast by the rubble. His heart pounded in his chest, but his breathing remained steady. He knew the rhythms of the marauders, their patrol routes, their blind spots. They were predictable, clumsy compared to the discipline of his Voidfang training.
He crept toward the nearest guard, a hulking brute armed with a spiked mace. The man's back was to him, his attention focused on the ruins. Kyrith moved like a wraith, his steps silent on the loose gravel. The Voidfang dagger slid smoothly into the gap between the guard's neck and shoulder, severing the artery with surgical precision. The man slumped forward without a sound, his blood pooling darkly beneath him. Kyrith dragged the body into the shadows, his movements quick and practiced. He wiped his blade clean on the guard's tunic before slipping back into the darkness. One down. He continued through the ruins, picking off guards with deadly efficiency. Each kill was swift, precise, leaving no time for alarm. The shadows seemed to shift and move with him, his whisper armor blending seamlessly into the environment. He was a ghost, a phantom of the spire's past come to haunt its defilers. As he moved closer to the heart of the ruins, Kyrith felt the air grow heavier. The etherium veins in the walls pulsed with greater intensity, their green glow casting the chamber in an otherworldly light. The faint hum of energy vibrated through the air, setting his fur on edge. He paused at the edge of a large archway, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene beyond. The marauders had unearthed a large circular chamber at the base of the spire. The floor was carved with intricate runes that glowed faintly with etherium energy, their patterns spiraling inward toward a central pedestal. On the pedestal rested the echo shard. The shard was a jagged fragment of etherium crystal, its surface shimmering with an inner light that shifted and danced like flame. Kyrith's breath caught as he gazed at it. The shard was beautiful, almost hypnotic, but there was something deeply unsettling about it. The way it seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat, the faint whispers that seemed to emanate from its core, it was as though the shard itself was alive.
The marauder leader stood near the pedestal, his massive form silhouetted against the shard's glow. His spiked armor gleamed faintly, and his gauntleted hands rested on the hilt of a massive cleaver. He was flanked by 2 lieutenants, both clad in lighter armor, but armed with wicked-looking blades.
Kyrith's mind raced. I can't take them head on, not with all those guards in the chamber. He scanned the room, noting the positions of the guards, the layout of the rubble, and the faint patterns of shadow cast by the torchlight. I'll need to separate them, pick them off one by one, and I'll need to do it fast. Kyrith crept along the edge of the chamber, his eyes fixed on a pair of guards standing near the far wall. He drew one of his throwing knives, the blade glinting faintly in the shard's light, and hurled it with precision. The knife struck the nearest torch, extinguishing its flame and plunging the corner of the room into darkness.
The guards reacted immediately, their voices raised in alarm as they moved to investigate. Kyrith was on them before they could reach the extinguished torch. His daggers flashed in the dim light, cutting through armor and flesh with practiced ease. The first guard fell with a strangled gasp, while the second managed only a brief shout before Kyrith's blade silenced him. The shout was enough to draw the attention of the other guards. Kyrith cursed under his breath as he heard the heavy footsteps of reinforcements approaching. He moved quickly, slipping into the shadows as the guards reached the bodies of their fallen comrades.
There's someone here, one of them shouted, his voice echoing off the chamber walls. The leader growled, his voice low and dangerous. Find them, now! Kyrith used the confusion to his advantage, striking from the darkness with deadly precision. Each attack was quick, calculated, leaving the guards disoriented and afraid. The chamber descended into chaos, the shouts of the marauders mingling with the clash of steel and the heavy thuds of falling bodies. As the last of the guards fell, Kyrith turned his attention to the leader. The massive marauder stood near the pedestal, his cleaver raised and ready. His lieutenants flanked him, their blades gleaming as they stepped forward to engage Kyrith. The first lieutenant lunged, his blade slicing through the air toward Kyrith's chest. Kyrith sidestepped the attack, his dagger flashing upward to deflect the strike. He countered with a quick thrust, the blade piercing the man's side. The lieutenant stumbled back, clutching his wound, before collapsing to the ground. The second lieutenant was more cautious, circling Kyrith with measured steps. Their blades clashed in a flurry of strikes and parries, the sound ringing out across the chamber. Kyrith's movements were fluid, his training evident in every motion. He feinted left, drawing the lieutenant's guard, before spinning and driving his dagger into the man's back. The leader roared, his cleaver swinging in a wide arc that forced Kyrith to leap back. The sheer force of the strike sent a shockwave through the air, and Kyrith felt the impact reverberate through his bones. "You've got guts, rat," the leader growled, his voice dripping with venom. "But guts won't save you." Kyrith didn't respond. He moved swiftly, closing the distance between them, and striking at the gaps in the leader's armor. The cleaver swung again, barely missing Kyrith as he darted to the side. The fight was brutal, each strike from the leader carrying enough force to shatter bone, each dodge from Kyrith a test of his speed and endurance. Finally, Kyrith saw his opening. The leader's swing left him overextended, his guard lowered. Kyrith surged forward, his daggers plunging into the man's exposed neck. The leader's eyes widened in shock as he dropped the cleaver, his massive form collapsing to the ground. Kyrith turned to the pedestal, his eyes drawn to the echo shard. The whispers grew louder as he approached, their voices faint but insistent. He reached out, his hand trembling as he touched the shard. A vision flooded his mind, a cascade of images and sensations that threatened to overwhelm him. He saw the spire as it once was, vibrant and alive, before it was consumed by flame and shadow. He saw the marauders digging, the shard's glow intensifying as they unearthed it. And he saw something else, a towering figure cloaked in darkness, its eyes burning with an otherworldly light. Kyrith staggered back, his breathing ragged. The shard pulsed in his hand, its whispers fading as he steadied himself. He slipped the shard into a pouch at his side, his mind racing with questions. What is this shard? And what does it want from me? The answers would come, he knew. But for now he had survived, and survival was enough. Chapter 4. Kyrith moved swiftly, his steps silent on the loose gravel of the ruined chamber. The echo shard's faint hum seemed to resonate with his heartbeat, a constant reminder of its presence as it rested in the pouch strapped securely to his side. The cavern was still save for the faint crackle of dying torches and the metallic scent of spilled blood. The marauders were dead, their desecration of the spire avenged, but the shard's whispers lingered in his mind. What did you see? The question gnawed at him, but the vision had been too fragmented, too overwhelming. He had seen the spire as it was, heard the screams of his kin again, and felt the weight of a shadow too vast to comprehend. The shard wanted something from him. Of that he was certain, but whether it was a guide, a tool, or a pawn remained unclear. The distant sound of rushing water pulled him from his thoughts. The path ahead curved sharply, and Kyrith quickened his pace, his keen senses scanning the darkness for signs of movement. He couldn't stay here. The shard's presence would undoubtedly draw others, more marauders, or worse. The cavern opened abruptly into a massive subterranean river. The water surged with a deep, resonant roar, its surface shimmering with faint streaks of etherium light. Kyrith crouched at the edge of the rocky bank, his eyes scanning the opposite shore. The air here was cooler, carrying the faint scent of damp moss and mineral-rich water. He removed the shard from his pouch, holding it up to the faint glow of the etherium veins in the rock above. The shard's pulsing light flickered, almost as though it were responding to the cavern itself. Kyrith frowned, his tail twitching as he turned the shard over in his hand. The runes etched into its surface seemed to shift and writhe, their meaning just out of reach. A sudden splash broke the silence. Kyrith's ears twitched, his daggers sliding into his hands as he melted into the shadows. His eyes scanned the riverbank, his muscles tensed for an attack. The sound came again, softer this time, a ripple in the water, faint but deliberate. "Who follows?" he hissed, his voice low and sharp. For a moment, there was only the sound of the rushing water. Then a figure stepped from the shadows, their movements slow and measured. They were clad in dark robes, their face hidden beneath a hood that cast deep shadows over their features. The faint glow of green eyes flickered beneath the hood, the only sign of life. "You hold something dangerous, traveller," the figure said, their voice a quiet rasp. "The shard is not meant for you." Kyrith narrowed his eyes, his daggers held loosely but ready. "And who are you to decide what the shard is meant for?" The figure chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "A keeper of secrets, a protector of balance, and perhaps your only ally in what lies ahead." They stepped closer, their movements unnervingly smooth. Kyrith tightened his grip on his blades but held his ground. The figure raised a gloved hand, their palm open and empty. "You may call me the Whispered Blade," they said, "and if you wish to survive what you've unleashed, you'll listen carefully." Kyrith's tail flicked, his gaze never leaving the figure. "Speak quickly. My patience is thin." The Whispered Blade inclined their head, the faint glow of their eyes narrowing. "The shard you carry is no mere artifact. It is a fragment of something ancient, something that predates even the spire. It was forged in the depths of the abyss, imbued with power not meant for mortal hands. That power will corrupt you if you are not careful." Kyrith frowned, his mind racing. "If it's so dangerous, why hasn't it destroyed me already?" The Whispered Blade's voice dropped, their tone grave. "Because it sees potential in you. The shard is a tool, but also a trap. It will whisper promises of power, of vengeance, of answers to your deepest questions. But the price it demands may be more than you can bear." Kyrith slid the shard back into his pouch, his gaze steady. "I don't have time for riddles." If you know what this shard is, then tell me how to use it." The whispered blade stepped closer, their movements so fluid they seemed to glide across the stone. "You misunderstand. The question is not how to use it, but whether you should." They gestured to the river, its rushing waters casting faint reflections on the cavern walls. "The shard is connected to Nitherith, the Abyssal One. Its power comes from the same darkness that consumed your kin. If you wish to understand it, you must first prove you can resist its pull." The whispered blade extended a hand toward the water. "There is a path beneath the river, one hidden from mortal eyes. It will test your resolve, your strength, and your will to survive. Only by walking this path will you learn the truth of the shard." Kyrith hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to be wary. But the thought of turning back, of abandoning the shard and the answers it held, was unthinkable. He nodded once, slipping his daggers into their sheaths. "Show me the way." The whispered blade led him to a narrow ledge at the river's edge, where the water churned violently against the rock. They raised their hand, tracing an intricate pattern in the air. The runes on the shard flared to life, their light illuminating a hidden doorway carved into the stone beneath the surface of the river. "Step through," the whispered blade said, their voice barely audible over the roar of the water. "But be warned, this path was not meant for the faint of heart." Kyrith took a deep breath, his muscles tensing as he stepped forward. The water surged around him, its icy grip pulling at his cloak as he descended into the passage. The air grew colder, the light from the shard casting eerie shadows on the walls, as the rushing sound of the river faded into silence. The passage twisted and turned, its walls narrowing until Kyrith was forced to crouch. The whispers returned, louder now, their voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony that clawed at his mind. He pressed forward, his claws scraping against the slick stone as the whispers grew into a deafening roar. The passage opened into a cavern unlike any Kyrith had seen before. The walls were lined with jagged spires of etherium, their light flickering erratically as though alive. The air was thick with a palpable sense of dread, the whispers now a constant presence that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. At the center of the cavern stood a figure, their form shrouded in darkness. Their eyes burned with a green light that pierced through the shadows, their presence radiating power. Kyrith's hand went to his daggers, but the figure raised a hand, their voice a low, resonant echo. "You seek answers," they said, "but answers come with a price." The cavern trembled, the etherium spires flaring with light as the ground beneath Kyrith's feet shifted. Shadows coalesced around him, taking the shape of twisted, nightmarish creatures with glowing eyes and jagged claws. They moved in unison, their movements eerily synchronized as they closed in. Kyrith drew his daggers, his body tensed for the fight. If this is the price, so be it. The battle was relentless, the shadowy creatures attacking in waves. Kyrith's movements were a blur of precision and agility, his Voidfang Daggers slicing through the shadows with each strike. The whispers grew louder with every kill, their voices praising and condemning him in equal measure. The figure watched in silence, their burning eyes unblinking as Kyrith fought. The cavern seemed to pulse with energy, the etherium spires reacting to the clash of blades and shadows. Kyrith's breaths came in ragged gasps, his muscles burning as he pushed himself beyond his limits. Finally, the last of the creatures fell, its form dissolving into a wisp of shadow. Kyrith dropped to one knee, his daggers trembling in his hands as the cavern fell silent. The figure stepped forward, their gaze fixed on him. "You have proven your resolve," they said, "but this is only the beginning." Chapter 5. Kyrith stood in the aftermath of his battle, the air around him heavy with the faint scent of scorched etherium and lingering shadows. His body ached from the relentless onslaught, his muscles trembling with fatigue. The cavern was silent now, save for the faint hum of the glowing spires lining the walls, their fractured light casting jagged reflections on the smooth stone floor. The figure before him remained still, their green glowing eyes unblinking as they watched him recover. Kyrith tightened his grip on the Voidfang Daggers, his breathing steady despite the exhaustion threatening to pull him down.
"What now?"
Kyrith growled, his voice sharp against the stillness.
"I've faced your monsters. I've survived. What more do you want from me?"
The figure's voice was a low, resonant hum, as if the shadows themselves spoke through them. "The trial is not over, Kyrith. The shard tests your resolve, but it also reveals your weakness. You must face what lies within." Kyrith frowned, his ears twitching. "What lies within?" The figure extended a hand, palm up. "Your past, your pain, the truth you've buried deep beneath vengeance." Kyrith stiffened. "I didn't come here to relive the past. I came for answers." "And you shall have them," the figure said, their voice calm but unyielding. "But only if you face yourself." The shard in Kyrith's pouch flared suddenly, its light searing through the fabric and casting the entire cavern in an eerie green glow. Kyrith staggered, clutching at his side as the light seemed to burrow into him, filling his veins with molten fire. The Voidfang daggers slipped from his grasp, clattering to the ground as the shard's energy overwhelmed him. The cavern dissolved, the spires fading into a swirling void of shadows and flickering light. Kyrith found himself standing on a flat plane of black glass, his reflection distorted and fractured beneath his feet. The air was thick and stifling, filled with a low, incessant whisper that gnawed at the edges of his mind. "You cannot hide. You cannot run. Face it." The voice was his own, but twisted and warped, as if spoken through 1,000 broken mirrors. Kyrith's chest tightened as the whispers grew louder, their words overlapping until they became a deafening roar. The glass beneath him rippled, and Kyrith froze as his reflection shifted. It was no longer his own. A towering figure stared back at him, its form cloaked in shadow and its eyes burning with the same green fire as the shard. Its presence radiated malice, yet there was something unnervingly familiar about it. "Who are you?" Kyrith demanded, his voice steady despite the pounding in his chest. The figure stepped forward, the glass cracking beneath its feet. "I am what you fear, what you deny, what you will become." Kyrith's daggers appeared in his hands, though he didn't remember drawing them. The figure mirrored his movements, its own blades glowing faintly in the void's flickering light. "I don't fear you," Kyrith said, his grip tightening. "I've faced worse." The figure chuckled, a sound that resonated through the void. "Have you? Or have you merely run from yourself, hiding behind vengeance and shadows?" It lunged, its movements a blur as it struck. Kyrith met the attack head-on, their blades clashing with a deafening ring that sent shockwaves rippling through the void. The force of the impact drove Kyrith back, but he regained his footing, his teeth bared in a snarl. The battle was unlike anything Kyrith had faced before. The figure moved with impossible speed and precision, matching his every strike with uncanny accuracy. Each blow felt like striking a mirror, the shards of his own doubts and fears cutting deeper with every exchange. "You cannot win," the figure hissed, its voice echoing from all directions. "You fight yourself, Kyrith, and you are losing." Kyrith gritted his teeth, his mind racing. He couldn't overpower the figure. Its movements were too perfect, its strikes too precise, but there had to be another way. As the figure lunged again, Kyrith sidestepped, his daggers dropping to his sides. He reached for the shard, its pulsing light burning against his chest. The whispers grew louder as he grasped it, their words now clear and insistent. "Accept it. Embrace it. Only then will you overcome." Kyrith hesitated, the weight of the shard in his hand almost unbearable. The figure stopped mid-strike, its burning gaze fixed on the shard. "Fool," it snarled. "You think you can control it?
The shard will consume you, as it has consumed countless others.
Maybe, Kyrith said, his voice low, but I won't let it control me. He plunged the shard into the void beneath his feet. The glass shattered, the darkness consuming him as the figure let out a roar of fury. When Kyrith awoke, he was back in the cavern, the shard's light dim but steady in his hand. The whispered blade stood before him, their expression unreadable beneath their hood.
You have made your choice, they said. The shard is bound to you now. Its power will aid you, but it will also test you at every turn. Do not falter, Kyrith, for the price of failure is far greater than you can imagine.
Kyrith rose to his feet, his daggers sliding back into their sheaths. What happens now? The whispered blade gestured to the far end of the cavern, where a faint light illuminated a narrow passage. The shard will guide you, but be warned, its path is not for the faint of heart. Kyrith nodded, his jaw set. I'll do what I must. As he stepped into the passage, the shard's whispers returned, their tones softer but no less insistent. Kyrith's hand tightened around its jagged edges, the faint glow casting his shadow long and distorted against the cavern walls. The passage twisted and turned, its walls lined with faintly glowing runes that pulsed in rhythm with the shard. The air grew colder with each step, the faint scent of ash and decay filling Kyrith's lungs. He pressed forward, his resolve unshaken despite the whispers clawing at his mind. At last, the passage opened into a vast chamber, its ceiling lost in darkness. A massive stone door stood at the far end, its surface carved with intricate patterns of etherium veins. The shard pulsed in Kyrith's hand, its whispers growing louder as he approached. He placed the shard into a circular indentation at the center of the door. The runes flared to life, their light spilling across the chamber as the door began to shift. A deep, resonant rumble filled the air as the stone parted, revealing a narrow bridge that stretched into the void. Kyrith stepped onto the bridge, the shard's light guiding his way. The path ahead was uncertain, but he would not falter. The shard had chosen him, and he would see this journey through to its end, no matter the cost. Chapter 6. The cavern stretched before Kyrith, a labyrinth of jagged stone and bioluminescent etherium veins that pulsed faintly in the oppressive darkness. Each step echoed, swallowed by the vast emptiness, yet carrying the weight of unseen threats. The air was thick and damp, laced with the metallic tang of etherium and the faint scent of decay. The echo shard hummed softly against Kyrith's chest, its whispers muted but persistent, weaving through his thoughts like a shadowed stream. He resisted the urge to touch it, to feel its smooth surface and the faint vibration that seemed to sync with his heartbeat. The shard had already shown its power, both its potential and its dangers, and Kyrith knew better than to trust it completely. He crouched low as the tunnel widened, revealing a cavern bathed in pale green light. Massive stalactites hung from the ceiling like jagged teeth, their surfaces glistening with moisture that dripped into a still, shallow pool below. The sound of the dripping water echoed in the silence, steady and rhythmic, like the ticking of an unseen clock. Kyrith's ears twitched. Something wasn't right. The air here felt charged, as though the cavern itself was holding its breath. He scanned the shadows, his Voidfang Daggers sliding silently into his hands. The shard's hum grew louder, its whispers threading through his mind. Danger lies ahead. Kyrith moved cautiously, his steps silent on the slick stone. The cavern was deceptively still, its shadows too deep, its silence too absolute. His eyes caught a faint movement near the pool, a ripple in the water, subtle but deliberate. He froze, his muscles coiled like a spring as the shadows shifted. A low growl rumbled through the cavern, deep and guttural, vibrating through the stone beneath his feet. The shadows near the pool began to coalesce,
taking form as glowing eyes pierced the darkness. One pair, then another, and another. The creatures emerged slowly, their forms long and sinuous, with scales that shimmered like polished obsidian. They were abyss stalkers, predators of the nether depths, known for their uncanny ability to blend into the shadows. Their movements were fluid, almost hypnotic, as they circled Kyrith, their claws clicking softly against the stone. Kyrith's grip on his daggers tightened. He had heard stories of abyss stalkers, how they hunted in packs, their coordination unmatched, their strikes precise and deadly. His training had prepared him for many foes, but these creatures were something else entirely. The largest of the stalkers, a beast nearly twice Kyrith's size, stepped forward, its glowing eyes locked onto his. It let out a guttural snarl, its fanged maw parting as it lunged. Kyrith moved on instinct, rolling to the side as the creature's claws raked the stone where he had stood. He came up on one knee, his daggers flashing as he struck at the stalker's flank. The blade found its mark, slicing through the beast's scales, but the wound was shallow. The creature snarled, unfazed, as its pack closed in. The cavern erupted into chaos as the pack attacked. Kyrith's movements were a blur, his daggers slashing and parrying as he fought to keep the creatures at bay. Their claws clashed against his armor, sparks flying as he twisted and dodged, his training pushing his body to its limits. One of the smaller stalkers lunged from the side, its jaws snapping inches from Kyrith's arm. He countered with a swift strike, his dagger piercing the beast's throat. It let out a strangled hiss before collapsing, its body dissolving into a pool of shadowy mist. The shard's hum grew louder, its whispers mingling with the sounds of battle. Kyrith felt its energy pulsing through him, sharpening his reflexes, heightening his senses, but the cost of its power was undeniable. The longer he wielded it, the more it tugged at his mind, tempting him with promises of invincibility. The pack regrouped, their movements eerily synchronized as they circled him. Kyrith's chest heaved, his breath coming in ragged bursts as he scanned their positions. The largest stalker let out a low growl, its body coiled like a spring, ready to strike. The shard's whisper cut through his thoughts, clear and commanding. "Use me." Kyrith hesitated, his fingers brushing against the shard's edge. The creatures lunged as one, their movements a blur of claws and teeth. Kyrith's instincts screamed at him to fight, to survive, but the shard's voice was insistent. "Unleash me." In a moment of desperation, Kyrith drew the shard from its pouch. Its light flared to life, flooding the cavern with an intense green glow that seemed to burn away the shadows. The creatures recoiled, their snarls turning to high-pitched whines as the shard's energy washed over them. The largest stalker hesitated, its glowing eyes narrowing as it faced Kyrith. The shard's whispers grew louder, their tone triumphant. Kyrith felt the power surging through him, a raw, unrelenting force that threatened to consume him. His vision blurred, the edges of the cavern dissolving into a haze of green light. He raised the shard, its energy pulsing in rhythm with his heartbeat. The stalker lunged, its massive form hurtling toward him. Kyrith released the shard's power in a blinding wave, the force of it ripping through the cavern like a thunderclap. The stalker froze mid-leap, its body disintegrating into a cloud of black mist. The remaining creatures scattered, their snarls fading into the distance as they retreated into the shadows. The cavern fell silent once more, the shard's light dimming as Kyrith staggered backward. His chest burned, his limbs trembling as the shard's whispers receded. He dropped to one knee, his breath ragged as he stared at the faintly glowing crystal in his hand. "You survived. But at what cost?" Kyrith forced himself to his feet, his body protesting with every movement. The shard's energy still thrummed faintly in his veins, its presence a constant reminder of the power he had unleashed. He slid it back into his pouch, his gaze scanning the cavern for signs of further threats. The air had changed,
the oppressive heaviness replaced by a faint warmth. Kyrith followed the source of the change, his steps cautious as he entered a narrow passage that wound upward. The faint scent of burning incense reached his nose, mingling with the metallic tang of etherium. The passage opened into a large chamber, its walls carved with intricate runes that glowed softly in the dim light. At the center of the room stood a group of Duskrin, their grey robes blending with the shadows. Their faces were obscured by hoods, their glowing green eyes the only visible feature. One of them stepped forward, their movements smooth and deliberate. "You carry the shard," they said, their voice calm but edged with caution. "And yet you are not consumed. Perhaps you are more than you seem." Kyrith's grip tightened on his daggers. "Who are you?" The figure inclined their head. "We are the Ashen Veil, keepers of the balance. The shard is not meant for mortal hands, yet here you stand, alive despite its power." Kyrith stepped forward, his gaze sharp. "I'm looking for answers. If you know what this shard is, tell me." The Ashen Veil murmured among themselves, their voices blending into an eerie harmony. The lead figure raised a hand, silencing them. "Answers come with a price, Kyrith of the Voidfang. Are you willing to pay it?" Kyrith nodded without hesitation. "I'll do whatever it takes." The figure gestured toward a glowing archway at the far end of the chamber. "Then step forward and face the truth." The archway led to a smaller chamber, its walls lined with glowing etherium veins that pulsed in time with Kyrith's heartbeat. At the center of the room stood a pedestal, its surface engraved with runes that seemed to shift and writhe like living things. The lead figure of the Ashen Veil stepped forward, their hood falling back to reveal a gaunt, angular face marked with faint scars. Their glowing eyes met Kyrith's, their expression unreadable. "The shard is a fragment of the Abyssal One," they said, their voice low. "Its power is ancient and vast, but it is not without purpose. The Abyssal One was not always a force of destruction. It was a guardian, a creator, until it was corrupted." Kyrith frowned. "Corrupted by what?" The figure's gaze hardened. "By us. By the Duskrin. We drew on its power, used it to build our cities, our weapons, our very existence. But we took too much, and the Abyssal One turned against us. The shard is all that remains of its original form, a sliver of what it once was." Kyrith's mind raced, the weight of their words sinking in. The shard wasn't just a tool. It was a fragment of something far greater, something that had shaped the very world he lived in. "And now?" he asked, his voice steady despite the storm raging within him. "What does the shard want from me?" The figure's expression softened, their tone almost reverent. "It seeks redemption, and it has chosen you as its vessel." Before Kyrith could respond, the chamber trembled, the etherium veins flaring with sudden intensity. The shard in his pouch pulsed violently, its whispers rising to a deafening roar. The Ashen Veil leader's eyes widened. "The Abyssal One stirs. The shard's power has awakened it." Kyrith drew his daggers, his body tensed for a fight. "What does that mean?" The leader turned to him, their voice urgent. "It means you must decide. Will you wield the shard's power and face the Abyssal One, or will you let it consume everything?" Kyrith's grip tightened on his weapons. The weight of the decision pressed down on him. But there was no time for doubt. The abyss awaited, and his path was clear. He stepped forward, the shard's light blazing as the chamber dissolved into darkness. Chapter 7. The darkness surrounding Kyrith was absolute, a void that swallowed sound, light, and even the faintest sense of direction. The echo shard pulsed against his chest, its light dim yet unwavering, guiding him through the oppressive blackness. His every step echoed faintly, though the sound seemed to stretch endlessly, vanishing into the void. The air was cold and dry, carrying the faint scent of ash and something metallic. Kyrith's Voidfang Daggers rested in his hands, their green glow a feeble counterpoint to the shard's hum. He moved cautiously, his senses heightened, aware of every shift in the air, every faint vibration beneath his feet. The path ahead was uneven, carved from stone that seemed unnaturally smooth in places and jagged in others. The whispers of the shard filled his mind, faint and fragmented, but growing louder with each step. "You are close. It waits for you." Kyrith's jaw tightened. He had heard stories of the Abyssal One, half myth, half warning whispered among the duskgrin. But now, standing on the edge of its domain, he felt the weight of its reality pressing down on him. He didn't trust the shard, but he couldn't deny its power, and he couldn't ignore the truth. This was the path he had chosen. The darkness began to lighten, faint streaks of green and blue weaving through the air like mist. The path widened into a massive cavern, its ceiling lost in shadow. The walls were lined with etherium veins, their light flickering erratically as if responding to Kyrith's presence. The whispers grew louder, their tone shifting from urgent to reverent, like a hymn sung by unseen voices. At the center of the cavern stood a massive archway, its surface etched with intricate runes that glowed faintly. The arch was ancient, its stone weathered and cracked, yet it radiated an undeniable power. The air around it seemed to vibrate, a low resonant hum that Kyrith felt deep in his bones. The Ashen Vale leader's words echoed in his mind. "The Abyssal One stirs. The shard's power has awakened it." Kyrith approached the archway cautiously, the shard's light flaring brighter with each step. The runes responded, their glow intensifying as he drew near. He reached out, his hand hovering just above the surface of the stone. The shard pulsed violently, and the whispers rose to a crescendo. "Enter." The runes flared, and the archway filled with a swirling vortex of light and shadow. Kyrith hesitated for only a moment before stepping through, the shard's hum resonating with the vibration of the portal. The world on the other side of the portal was unlike anything Kyrith had ever seen. The sky, or what passed for it, was a swirling maelstrom of green and black, the light shifting and twisting as though alive. The ground beneath his feet was jagged and uneven, a patchwork of obsidian-like stone and glowing etherium veins. The air was heavy, thick with energy that crackled faintly against his fur. The abyss stretched out before him, a vast, chaotic landscape that defied reason. Mountains rose and fell in impossible angles, rivers of molten etherium carving paths through the jagged terrain. Shadows moved at the edges of his vision, their forms indistinct yet menacing. The shard's whispers were constant now, threading through his thoughts with an almost soothing rhythm. Kyrith tightened his grip on his daggers, his senses on high alert. This place was alive, and it was watching him. In the distance, a massive structure loomed. It was a tower, or perhaps a fortress, its shape shifting as Kyrith tried to focus on it. Its surface was covered in runes that pulsed with a deep, blood-red light, their patterns spiraling upward into the swirling sky. The shard flared in his hand, its whispers clear for the first time. "Go, it awaits." The path to the fortress was treacherous, winding through narrow canyons and across crumbling bridges of stone. The ground trembled beneath Kyrith's feet, as though the abyss itself was reacting to his presence. The shadows grew bolder, their forms coalescing into shapes that seemed almost humanoid. Kyrith's first encounter came as he crossed a narrow ridge, the shard's light casting long shadows across the jagged rocks. A low growl rumbled behind him, and he spun, his daggers raised. A creature emerged from the darkness, its form shifting and amorphous, yet unmistakably predatory. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and its body seemed to writhe with tendrils of shadow. The creature lunged, its movements impossibly fast. Kyrith ducked low, his daggers flashing as he struck at its midsection. The blades passed through its body with little resistance, and the creature let out a deafening screech, its tendrils lashing out. Kyrith moved with practiced precision, his Voidfang Daggers carving through the creature's shifting form. Each strike sent ripples of green energy through its body, and the shard pulsed in response, its whispers urging him on. The battle was brutal, the creature relentless in its attacks, but Kyrith's training held, his movements a blur of speed and precision. With a final strike, he plunged both daggers into the creature's core, the energy from the shard surging through the blades. The creature let out a final, guttural scream before dissolving into a cloud of shadow. Kyrith stood over the remnants, his breathing heavy, his muscles trembling with exhaustion. The shard's light dimmed slightly, its whispers fading into a low hum. You are strong, but the abyss tests all. The fortress of Netherworlds. The fortress loomed closer, its massive gates carved from a single slab of black stone veined with glowing etherium. Kyrith approached cautiously, his eyes scanning the surrounding terrain for signs of movement. The shard pulsed steadily now, its light casting eerie patterns across the ground. The gates opened with a low, resonant groan, revealing a vast hall lined with towering pillars. The air inside was heavy, thick with the scent of ash and ozone. The walls were covered in runes, their light flickering as though alive. At the far end of the hall stood a massive throne, carved from the same black stone as the gates. Seated upon the throne was a figure shrouded in shadow, their form indistinct yet undeniably powerful. Their eyes burned with a green light that pierced the darkness, and their voice echoed through the hall deep and resonant. "You have come far, Kyrith of the Voidfang, but the shard has brought you here for a purpose." Kyrith stepped forward, his daggers at the ready. "And what purpose is that?" The figure leaned forward, their eyes narrowing. "To decide the fate of the abyss, to wield its power, or to destroy it." The figure rose from the throne, their form towering over Kyrith. The air in the hall grew colder, the flickering runes casting long shadows across the stone floor. "The Abyssal One was not always a force of destruction," the figure said. "It was a guardian, a creator, until the greed of mortals corrupted it. The shard is all that remains of its original purpose, a fragment of hope in a sea of despair." Kyrith tightened his grip on the shard, its light pulsing in time with his heartbeat. "And what happens if I destroy it?" The figure's eyes burned brighter. "The abyss will collapse, taking everything with it, including you. But the corruption will end. The cycle of destruction will be broken." Kyrith's jaw clenched. "And if I wield it?" The figure's voice softened, almost mournful. "You will become the Abyssal One, its power yours to command. But the cost will be your soul." The choice loomed before Kyrith, heavier than any he had faced. The shard whispered in his mind, its voice soothing, yet insistent. "Choose." The hall trembled, the runes flaring with blinding light as the abyss itself seemed to awaken. The shadows coalesced around Kyrith, their forms shifting and writhing as the figure on the throne watched silently. Kyrith closed his eyes, his mind racing. The shard's whispers filled his thoughts, mingling with his own doubts and fears. He opened his eyes, his gaze steady as he stepped forward. "I will not let the abyss destroy what remains of this world," he said, his voice firm, "but I won't let it consume me, either." The figure nodded slowly, their shadowy form dissolving into the light. "Then you must find the balance. The shard is yours, Kyrith of the Voidfang. Use it wisely." The light intensified, engulfing the hall as the shard flared to life. Kyrith felt its power surge through him, its whispers fading into silence. When the light subsided, he stood alone in the hall, the shard glowing faintly in his hand. The path ahead was uncertain, but Kyrith knew one thing for sure: the abyss was watching, and his journey was far from over. Chapter 8. The shard's light flickered faintly as Kyrith stepped through the crumbling gates of the abyssal fortress, its weight a constant reminder of the choice he had made. The air around him felt alive, thrumming with energy that pressed against his senses like an unrelenting tide. His muscles ached, his fur damp with sweat, but the mission ahead left no room for rest. The landscape of the abyss had shifted during his time in the fortress. What once were jagged peaks and winding chasms now lay veiled in an oppressive mist, its green tendrils snaking through the darkness like living things. The shard pulsed against his chest, the faint whispers growing louder, though their tone carried a warning now, not an invitation. "They are coming! Prepare yourself!" Kyrith's claws flexed against the hilts of his Voidfang Daggers. He scanned the horizon, his amber eyes narrowing as movement stirred in the mist. Shadowy figures emerged, their forms indistinct yet menacing, moving with purpose and eerie synchronization. These were not the abyss stalkers he had encountered earlier. These were veil-bound, remnants of the Abyssal One's former servants, now twisted and corrupted by its lingering power. The veil-bound advanced in silence, their movements fluid and unnerving. Kyrith crouched low, his daggers gleaming faintly in the shard's light. His breath was steady, his mind focused. He had faced worse before, or so he told himself. The first veil-bound lunged, its form shifting mid-leap, jagged limbs extending toward him. Kyrith twisted to the side, his dagger slicing through the creature's arm. The strike connected, but the wound closed almost instantly, the veil-bound's body reforming with a sickening slurp. "Persistent," Kyrith muttered, ducking as another veil-bound struck from behind. He spun, his blades flashing as he struck the creature's core. This time the shard flared, and the veil-bound let out a shriek, its form dissolving into a cloud of ash and shadow. "Use me," the shard whispered, its voice clear in Kyrith's mind. "You cannot defeat them without my power." Kyrith's jaw tightened. He hated relying on the shard, hated the way it felt as though it were burrowing deeper into his mind with every use, but he couldn't deny its effectiveness. He let the shard's energy flow through him, his daggers glowing with the same eerie light as the shard. The veil-bound hesitated, their movements faltering as the shard's power radiated outward. Kyrith seized the opportunity, his strikes precise and unrelenting, each attack connected with their cause, the shard's energy disintegrating them, one by one. When the last of the veil-bound fell, the mist receded slightly, the oppressive weight in the air lifting just enough for Kyrith to breathe more easily. He stood amidst the remnants of the battle, his chest heaving as the shard's whispers subsided. As Kyrith prepared to move forward, a sound broke the silence, a faint rustling, followed by the scrape of claws against stone. He turned sharply, his daggers raised, as a figure emerged from the shadows. The newcomer was a Duskrin, their lithe frame covered in armor similar to Kyrith's, though its design was more ornate, with intricate etchings that glowed faintly in the darkness. Their fur was a deep charcoal grey, their eyes a piercing silver that seemed to reflect the faint light of the shard. "I expected to find corpses," the stranger said, their voice calm but edged with curiosity. "Instead, I find you. Impressive." Kyrith didn't lower his blades. "Who are you?" The Duskrin raised their hands in a gesture of peace. "Relax, Shadow Walker. I am Aelthar, a seeker of truths and a survivor of the Abyss's corruption, and you are Kyrith, the one they whisper about. The Shard-bearer. Kyrith's grip on his daggers tightened. How do you know my name? Elthar smirked. The abyss has eyes everywhere, and its whispers carry far, but you're lucky you found me. The veil-bound are only the beginning. The abyss knows you've taken the shard, and it will stop at nothing to reclaim what belongs to it. Kyrith studied Aeltha carefully, his instincts urging caution. Trust was a luxury he couldn't afford, but he couldn't deny the truth in their words. The abyss was alive, and it wanted its shard back. What do you want? Kyrith asked, his voice steady. Aelthar tilted their head, their silver eyes narrowing. To survive the same as you. But survival here requires more than skill. It requires allies. Kyrith hesitated, weighing his options. Aeltha was an unknown, but they seemed capable, and the shard's power was draining him faster than he cared to admit. Finally, he lowered his daggers, though he kept them within easy reach. Fine, he said, but if you betray me... You'll kill me, Aelthar finished, a wry smile tugging at their lips. Understood. Together, Kyrith and Aelthar pressed deeper into the abyss, their movements swift and silent. The landscape grew more treacherous, the ground splitting into jagged chasms that glowed with molten etherium. The shard's light flickered erratically, its whispers growing louder and more urgent. They reached a cliff overlooking a vast expanse of the abyss. Below, an army of veil-bound swarmed, their forms shifting and writhing like a sea of shadows. At the center of the horde stood a massive figure, its body covered in armor that pulsed with green light. Its eyes burned with the same eerie glow as the shard, and its presence radiated raw, unrelenting power. That's the Abyssal One's general, Aelthar said, their voice low. A creature born from the abyss's corruption. If it reaches the shard, everything ends. Kyrith's jaw clenched. The shard pulsed against his chest, its whispers filling his mind. Confront it. Use me. The army below began to move, their formation shifting as they marched toward the fortress. Kyrith and Aelthar exchanged a glance, unspoken understanding passing between them. We stop them here, Kyrith said, his voice resolute. Aelthar nodded, their blades gleaming in the dim light. Then, let's make it count. The fight that followed was chaos incarnate. Kyrith and Aelthar moved as one, their strikes swift and deadly as they cut through the veil-bound. The shard's power coursed through Kyrith, his daggers glowing with an intensity that matched the general's gaze. The battlefield was a blur of movement and light, the air thick with the sounds of clashing steel and guttural roars. The ground trembled beneath their feet as the general advanced, its massive form tearing through the battlefield with terrifying speed. Kyrith's strikes found their mark, the shard's energy searing through the veil-bound like a blade through parchment. But the power came at a cost. Each use of the shard drained him further, its whispers growing louder, more insistent. Give in. Let me take control. No, Kyrith hissed through gritted teeth, his movements faltering as the shard's pull threatened to overwhelm him. Aelthar stepped in, their blades flashing as they blocked a strike meant for Kyrith. Stay focused, Shard-bearer. The abyss doesn't play fair. Kyrith nodded, forcing himself to push the shard's influence aside. Together they turned their attention to the general, its massive form towering over the battlefield. The final confrontation was brutal, the general's attacks relentless. But Kyrith and Aelthar fought with everything they had, their strikes coordinated and precise. The shard's power flared one last time, its energy surging through Kyrith's daggers as he delivered the killing blow. The general let out a deafening roar, its body disintegrating into a cloud of ash and shadow. The battlefield fell silent, the remaining veil-bound retreating into the darkness. As the dust settled, Kyrith collapsed to one knee, his chest heaving as the shard's whispers faded.
Aelthar stood beside him, their silver eyes sharp but weary. "You did well," they said, their voice softer now. "But this isn't over. The abyss won't stop until it reclaims what you've taken."
Kyrith nodded, his grip tightening on the shard. "Then we keep moving. There has to be a way to end this." Aelthar extended a hand, pulling Kyrith to his feet. "There is, but it won't be easy."
Together, they turned toward the horizon, the shard's light guiding their path as the abyss stirred once more.
Chapter 9. The abyss was quieter now, though the silence was far from peaceful. The shadows shifted uneasily, and the faint hum of etherium veins carried an almost mournful tune. Kyrith moved carefully through the jagged landscape, his body heavy with fatigue but his mind sharp. The shard at his chest pulsed with a steady rhythm, its whispers subdued but present, like a constant breath on the back of his neck. Beside him, Aelthar walked with a measured pace, their silver eyes scanning the horizon. Though their movements seemed calm, Kyrith could feel their tension, the way their hand lingered near the hilt of their blade, the slight twitch in their ears at every sound. "The abyss doesn't rest for long," Aelthar said, breaking the silence. "You've wounded it, but now it's watching, waiting." Kyrith glanced at them. "For what?" Aelthar's gaze didn't waver. "For you to falter." Their journey led them along the Veinspire path, a winding trail carved through the cliffs of the abyss. The air grew colder as they ascended, the faint scent of burning etherium mingling with the acrid tang of ash. The shard's glow dimmed as they climbed, its energy seemingly drawn toward the towering spires of rock that loomed above them. "This place feels wrong," Kyrith muttered, his claws gripping the jagged stone for balance. Aelthar nodded. "The Veinspire path is said to lead to the heart of the abyss. Few have ventured this far and returned. The shard draws us here for a reason, but the abyss won't let us pass easily." Kyrith tightened his grip on his Voidfang Daggers. The shard's whispers grew louder as they approached the summit, their tone shifting from warning to something more urgent. You are not alone." The attack came without warning. A screech echoed through the air, followed by a flurry of movement in the shadows. Kyrith spun just in time to see a figure lunge from the darkness, a veil-bound unlike any he'd encountered before. Its form was humanoid but grotesquely elongated, its limbs twisted and clawed. Its eyes burned with the same green light as the shard, and its movements were unnervingly fast. Kyrith ducked low, his daggers slicing upward as the creature's claws raked the air above him. Aelthar moved in tandem, their blade flashing as they struck the creature's flank. The veil-bound let out a guttural snarl, its body twisting unnaturally as it lashed out. The shard flared in Kyrith's chest, its energy coursing through his veins. He struck with precision, his daggers carving into the creature's core. The veil-bound shrieked, its body convulsing before dissolving into a cloud of ash. "More incoming!" Aelthar shouted, their silver eyes darting toward the shadows. 3 more veil-bound emerged, their movements synchronized as they closed in. Kyrith and Aelthar fought back to back, their blades moving in perfect harmony. The battle was brutal, each strike met with resistance as the veil-bound adapted to their attacks. Kyrith felt the shard's pull growing stronger, its whispers urging him to unleash its power. But he resisted, relying on his own skill and the strength of his ally. Together they cut through the veil-bound, their bodies dissolving into the void. When the last veil-bound fell, Kyrith leaned against the cliff wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The shard's light pulsed erratically, its whispers louder now, more insistent. "The abyss watches. It knows you." Kyrith shook his head, his claws gripping the edge of the cliff. "What does it want?" Aelthar approached, their expression grim. "The abyss doesn't want. It takes, and it's decided you're worth taking." Kyrith frowned, his gaze shifting toward the path ahead. The Veinspire path narrowed, its jagged edges leading toward a massive rift in the distance. The air there shimmered with an unnatural light, the etherium veins glowing brighter as they approached. "What's beyond the rift?" Kyrith asked, his voice low. Aelthar's silver eyes darkened. "The source of the abyss's power. And whatever's waiting for us, it won't be kind." The rift was unlike anything Kyrith had ever seen. It stretched across the cliffside like a wound in the fabric of reality, its edges glowing with a searing green light. Tendrils of shadow writhed within its depths, their movements hypnotic and unnerving. The air around it was thick with energy, each breath Kyrith took feeling like a weight pressing against his chest. The shard pulsed violently, its whispers now a steady chant. Kyrith felt its energy resonating with the rift, the connection between them undeniable. Enter. Face the truth. Aelthar placed a hand on Kyrith's shoulder, their expression somber. "This is it. Whatever lies beyond that rift, it's tied to the shard, to you. Are you ready?" Kyrith nodded, his grip tightening on his daggers. "I've come this far. I'm not turning back now." Together they stepped into the rift. The world beyond the rift was surreal, a shifting expanse of light and shadow that defied logic. The ground beneath their feet was smooth and reflective, like polished glass, and the sky above was a swirling maelstrom of green and black. The air was heavy with energy, the shard's light casting long, distorted shadows across the landscape. At the center of the expanse stood a massive figure, its form cloaked in shadow and its eyes burning with an intense green light. Its presence radiated power, and Kyrith felt the shard react, its whispers rising to a deafening roar. The figure spoke, its voice deep and resonant, echoing through the void. "You carry the shard, Kyrith of the Voidfang, but do you understand what it is? What you are?" Kyrith stepped forward, his daggers raised. "Then tell me." The figure's gaze bore into him, its voice a low growl. "The shard is a fragment of the Abyssal One's heart, a piece of its soul. You are its bearer, chosen to wield its power. But the abyss is not without cost. To command it is to become it." Kyrith's chest tightened, the weight of the shard suddenly unbearable. "What does that mean?" The figure raised a massive hand, its shadowy form shifting. "It means your choice is simple. Surrender to the abyss, or destroy the shard and face oblivion." The ground trembled, the light of the rift flaring as the figure's form began to shift. It grew larger, more imposing, its shadow spreading across the expanse. Kyrith felt the shard's pull intensify, its energy coursing through him with a ferocity that threatened to overwhelm him. Aelthar stepped beside him, their silver eyes fixed on the figure. "You don't have to do this alone, Kyrith." Kyrith glanced at them, the shard's whispers clawing at his mind. "Then let's finish this." The figure roared, its voice shaking the very fabric of the abyss. Kyrith and Aelthar moved as one, their blades flashing as they charged toward the abyssal heart. Chapter 10. The world trembled beneath Kyrith's feet as the Abyssal One rose to its full height, its shadow stretching across the fractured landscape. The air pulsed with power, thick with the weight of an ancient force awakening after eons of slumber. The echo shard flared violently against Kyrith's chest, its light battling against the oppressive darkness. But the whispers that had guided him were now silent. The Abyssal One's voice boomed across the expanse, deep and resonant, as though the abyss itself was speaking. "You dare to carry my heart, to defy the will of the abyss? Foolish, fleeting creature." Kyrith stepped forward, his Voidfang daggers glinting faintly in the shard's glow.
His body ached from the weight of the shard's energy, but his resolve burned brighter. "Your heart chose me," he said, his voice steady. "And I'm here to end this, one way or another." The Abyssal One tilted its head, its glowing green eyes narrowing. "End? There is no end to the abyss. It is eternal as you shall be, should you surrender to its embrace." Aelthar moved to Kyrith's side, their silver eyes sharp and unyielding. "Ignore its words," they said. "The Abyssal One thrives on doubt. We've come this far. We finish it now." The Abyssal One struck first, its massive shadowy arms slamming into the ground with enough force to shatter the reflective surface beneath them. Kyrith and Aelthar leapt apart, their movements swift and practiced, as shards of broken stone erupted around them. Kyrith surged forward, his daggers slicing through the Abyssal One's arm. The creature roared, its shadow recoiling as green energy crackled along its form. Aelthar followed up with a flurry of strikes, their blade glowing with etherium light as they targeted the creature's core. The Abyssal One countered with a deafening roar, its form shifting and twisting, its limbs extended, becoming tendrils of shadow that lashed out in all directions. Kyrith ducked and weaved, his daggers flashing as he cut through the tendrils, but each one dissolved and reformed, unrelenting in their assault. Aelthar moved with precision, their strikes calculated and efficient, but even they struggled against the Abyssal One's overwhelming power. "It's regenerating too fast," they shouted, dodging a swipe from one of the tendrils. "We need to weaken it." The shard pulsed violently, its light flaring as the Abyssal One's attention shifted to Kyrith. "Ah, the shard-bearer," it rumbled. "You feel its power, don't you? Its promise of strength, of eternity. Embrace it, and you shall become one with the abyss." Kyrith gritted his teeth, his mind racing as the shard's whispers returned, faint but insistent. "Use me. Release me." Kyrith hesitated, the shard's energy coursing through him, both a temptation and a threat. He glanced at Aelthar, who was fending off another wave of tendrils. The Abyssal One's power was immense, its form relentless. They couldn't win this fight with brute force alone. "Cover me!" Kyrith shouted, gripping the shard tightly in his hand. Aelthar's silver eyes widened. "Don't do anything reckless!" Ignoring the warning, Kyrith focused on the shard, letting its energy flow through him. The light around him intensified, blinding in its brilliance, as the whispers grew louder. "Let go. Let me take the burden." Kyrith exhaled sharply, his mind clearing as he surrendered to the shard's power. Not fully, but enough to channel its energy. The tendrils around him faltered, recoiling from the light as it burned away the shadows. The Abyssal One let out a guttural roar, its form flickering as the shard's power disrupted its connection to the abyss. Aelthar took advantage of the opening, their blade slicing through the creature's core with precision. The Abyssal One staggered, its form unraveling as green energy spilled from its wounds. "You've weakened it!" Aelthar shouted. "Now finish it!" The shard pulsed in Kyrith's hand, its whispers urging him forward. He leapt onto the Abyssal One's crumbling form, his daggers glowing with the shard's energy. With a final determined strike, he plunged both blades into the creature's heart, the shard's light flaring brighter than ever before. The Abyssal One let out a final, deafening roar as its form disintegrated, the shadows collapsing into themselves. The rift trembled violently, the ground beneath them cracking and splitting apart. Kyrith jumped back, landing beside Aelthar as the rift began to collapse. "We have to move!" Aelthar shouted, grabbing Kyrith's arm. Together, they sprinted toward the edge of the collapsing rift, the shard's energy guiding their path. The air was thick with the sound of crumbling stone and the wails of the abyss, its power unraveling as the Abyssal One fell. They emerged from the rift just as it closed behind them, the swirling light fading into darkness. The abyss was silent now, its oppressive presence diminished.
Kyrith dropped to his knees, his chest heaving as the shard's light dimmed. Aelthar knelt beside him, their expression both relieved and wary. "It's done," they said. "You destroyed the Abyssal One." Kyrith nodded, his grip on the shard loosening. "But the shard is still here. Its power hasn't gone." Aelthar's silver eyes met his. "Then it's up to you to decide what to do with it." Kyrith stared at the shard, its faint glow pulsing steadily in his hand. The whispers were quiet now, but he knew they wouldn't remain silent forever. The abyss had been defeated, but its influence lingered, waiting for the next opportunity to rise. He stood slowly, his daggers sheathed, the shard resting against his chest. The path ahead was uncertain, but Kyrith knew one thing: the battle wasn't over. It had only just begun. The journey through the abyss had tested Kyrith in ways he hadn't thought possible, but he had survived. Now, with the shard in his possession, and the abyss subdued, a new chapter awaited. One filled with new threats, new allies, and the ever-present question of whether the shard's power was a gift or a curse. Chapter 11. The silence of the abyss was deafening. Kyrith stood on the fractured ground where the rift had collapsed, the faint pulse of the echo shard against his chest, the only remaining evidence of the Abyssal One's power. The oppressive energy that had pressed against his senses for so long was gone, leaving a strange emptiness in its place. His breathing slowed, his body still trembling from the fight. But the shard's whispers had quieted, their once relentless murmur reduced to a faint hum. Aelthar approached, their silver eyes scanning the broken landscape. "The abyss feels lighter," they said, their voice low, "as though something vital has been ripped from it." Kyrith nodded, though the weight in his chest hadn't lifted. "It's not gone, not completely." He glanced at the shard, its green light dim but steady. "The Abyssal One is defeated, but this thing still holds a piece of it." Aelthar frowned. "Then we should destroy it before it corrupts again." Kyrith hesitated, his hand tightening around the shard. The idea of destroying it had lingered in his mind since he first claimed it. But now, standing on the edge of victory, he felt the enormity of that choice. The shard wasn't just a weapon. It was a part of the abyss, a remnant of something ancient and unknowable. "Not yet," Kyrith said, his voice firm. "Not until I understand it." The path back through the abyss was eerily quiet. The twisting landscapes and shifting shadows that had once felt alive were now still, as though the abyss itself was mourning the loss of its master. Kyrith and Aelthar moved swiftly, their senses attuned to any lingering threats, but none appeared. As they approached the remnants of the abyssal fortress, Kyrith paused, his gaze sweeping across the ruins. The once massive structure was crumbling, its etherium veins darkened and lifeless. The fortress had been a monument to the Abyssal One's power, but now it was just a hollow shell. "We should leave this place," Aelthar said, their voice breaking the silence. "The longer we stay, the more danger we invite." Kyrith nodded, his thoughts heavy. He turned toward the distant exit, the shard pulsing faintly as they began their ascent out of the abyss. The light of the surface world was blinding after so long in the abyss. Kyrith shielded his eyes as he stepped onto solid ground, the cool breeze carrying the faint scent of earth and greenery. It was a sharp contrast to the oppressive darkness below, and for a moment Kyrith allowed himself to breathe deeply, savouring the freshness of the air. Aelthar emerged behind him, their silver eyes narrowing as they surveyed their surroundings. "It feels strange," they said, "as though the abyss has left its mark on this place." Kyrith followed their gaze. The land near the rift's entrance was scorched, the grass and trees withered and blackened. Even the sky seemed dimmer, a faint green tint marring the horizon.
Whatever happened down there, Kyrith said, it's not over.
The Duskrin clans had gathered near the rift's edge, their numbers greater than Kyrith had expected. Their armor glinted faintly in the dim light, and their faces were shadowed by hoods and masks. Whispers rippled through the crowd as Kyrith and Aelthar approached, their gazes fixed on the shard that hung around Kyrith's neck. A tall Duskrin with scarred features stepped forward, their voice carrying authority. "Kyrith of the Voidfang," they said, their tone measured. "You've returned from the abyss. Tell us, what has become of it?" Kyrith met their gaze, his shoulders squared. "The Abyssal One is defeated. The rift has collapsed, but the shard remains, and its power is still a threat." Murmurs spread through the crowd, some voices filled with relief, others with fear. The leader raised a hand, silencing them. "And what do you intend to do with it?"
Kyrith hesitated. The weight of their question pressed against him, but he knew his answer. "I'll keep it," he said. "For now, its power is too dangerous to leave unguarded, but it's also not something that should be destroyed lightly. I'll find a way to ensure it doesn't harm anyone else." The leader studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Then you carry a great burden, Kyrith. But know this, if the shard corrupts you, we will stop you, no matter the cost." Kyrith's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "I wouldn't expect anything less." As the crowd began to disperse, Kyrith and Aelthar stepped away from the gathering, their path leading toward the distant horizon. The shard pulsed faintly against Kyrith's chest, its whispers subdued, but ever present.
"You could have given it to them," Aelthar said, their tone neutral. "Let the clans deal with it." Kyrith shook his head. "They'd fight over it. Use it against each other. I can't let that happen." Aelthar was silent for a moment before nodding. "Then I hope you know what you're doing." Kyrith smirked faintly, though his eyes remained fixed on the horizon. "So do I." The journey ahead was uncertain, the weight of the shard a constant reminder of the choices Kyrith had made. But as he walked, the echoes of the abyss grew fainter, replaced by the sound of wind through the trees and the faint calls of distant creatures. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Kyrith allowed himself to hope. The abyss had tested him, pushed him to his limits, but it hadn't broken him. And though the shard's power lingered, he was determined to master it, or, if necessary, to destroy it. The road stretched before him, wide and open, and Kyrith, shard-bearer and shadow walker, stepped forward, ready for whatever came next.